My daughter-in-law's family pushed my disabled son into the freezing lake just because he wet his pants. He hit his head and almost drowned. I screamed for help, but they just laughed. When the ambulance arrived, I called my daughter and told her, "Make the people who hurt your brother pay for what they did." I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my story of revenge from. I want to know how far it has traveled. Tonight, I came to Hidden Lake Resort with my son, Stephen, to attend the wedding melinching of Elizabeth Montclair, the sister of Valerie, my daughter-in-law. The air was so cold it cut my skin, but the landscape in front of me looked like a painting. The wooden resort was hidden among tall pines, with hundreds of yellow lights suspended, reflecting on the surface of the lake, as still as a mirror. I sat next to Stephen, in an isolated corner of the party. He was wearing a custom-made suit, still looking as handsome as ever, but his motionless legs in the wheelchair squeezed my heart. Stephen smiled, trying to look cheerful, but I knew he was making a great effort to maintain that facade. On the stage, Mr. Montclair, Valerie's father, spoke in a loud voice, full of pride, recounting the achievements of the Montclair family, the big businesses, the powerful connections. Valerie was by his side with a perfect smile, rehearsed down to the last detail, but her eyes never once looked toward her husband. I noticed that she and her mother, Mrs. Montclair, looked at Stephen from time to time. It wasn't a look of concern, but of annoyance, as if my son's presence was a stain that ruined the perfect picture of that night. The party continued with soft music and animated laughter. I was telling Stephen an old anecdote, trying to distract him, when suddenly he leaned toward me with a trembling voice, full of panic. "Mom, I can't control it." I looked down and saw a dark stain spreading on his beige pants. A slight smell of urine began to be noticeable, almost imperceptible, but in that elegant atmosphere, it was like an alarm that resonated in my head. I felt a knot in my chest. "It's okay, son," I whispered, trying to remain calm. "Let's go to the restroom. We'll fix it quickly." But it was already too late. Some guests frowned, one even covered his nose and murmured something to his companion. I felt the curious, judgmental glances, like invisible knives stabbing at me and my son. At that moment, Valerie appeared. Her face was flushed, not with worry, but with anger and shame. She approached with quick steps, without saying a word, staring at the small puddle under Stephen's feet. Her eyes were cold, as if my son had committed an unforgivable sin. "You're making me look ridiculous," she whispered through clenched teeth, her voice low enough for only us to hear. "Everyone is looking." I froze, unable to believe what I was hearing. This was the woman Stephen loved, the one he had sacrificed so much for. It all happened too fast. Before I could react, Valerie grabbed the wheelchair handles and pushed hard, with fierce determination, toward the edge of the lake. Time seemed to stop. I saw the chair tilt, losing balance on the sloping ground. Stephen tried to hold on, but the momentum was too strong. The chair flipped over and my son's fragile body flew out. He rolled across the ground and slammed into the dark, freezing water of the lake. The splash echoed in my head like an explosion. A deathly silence enveloped the party, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Then, as in a nightmare, laughter was heard among the tipsy guests. They thought it was a joke, a funny accident on a perfect night. I screamed, a cry that tore through the darkness, that ripped out my soul. "Help! Help my son!" My tears blinded me. I couldn't control anything anymore. I looked toward the Montclair family, searching for a little humanity. But Mr. Montclair just stood still, paralyzed. and his wife covered her mouth, not out of anguish, but to hide her embarrassment. No one moved. The other guests watched. Some even recorded with their phones, as if it were a scene from a show. Suddenly, a silhouette came running out of the darkness. It was Mr. Ernest, the lake caretaker, in his old resort uniform. He didn't hesitate for a second. He took off his jacket and plunged into the water. I held my breath, my gaze fixed on the surface. Seconds later, he emerged, dragging Stephen's lifeless body. He struggled with all his might to bring him to the shore, step by step, in that freezing water. I ran toward them and knelt beside my son. His skin was white as wax, his lips purple, his body shaking. I hugged him, called his name, tears falling onto his face. "Stephen, son, wake up, please." With trembling hands, I took out my phone and dialed the emergency number. I could barely speak from the desperation. While I was trying to explain to the operator, Mr. Ernest knelt beside me. He took my arm. His face was pale, not just from the cold. He stammered in a trembling voice. "Ma'am, down there, when I dove, I saw—" But I didn't get to hear him. The ambulance siren sounded in the distance, cutting off his words. I pushed his hand away and screamed into the phone. "They're coming! Please, hurry!" The paramedics quickly placed Stephen on the stretcher. I feel... I only managed to look back, toward Mr. Ernest. He was still there, his eyes full of fear and urgency, as if he wanted to tell me something more. But I no longer had time. I climbed inside the ambulance. The door slammed shut, leaving the chaos of the party behind. The sound of the heart monitor went beep, beep constantly in the room, like a faint heartbeat of life. I sat next to the bed, holding Stephen's cold hand, looking at my son lying there, breathing with difficulty through the oxygen mask. His face was pale, his lips still slightly purple from that terrifying night. I stroked his hair, sticky with sweat, and felt my heart break. My son, the child I cared for since his first days of life, now lay as fragile as a candle in the wind. The doctor entered. His voice was serious but reassuring. "Mrs. Mary, the young man has passed the critical moment. It was severe hypothermia shock, but fortunately we were able to intervene in time. We'll keep him under observation for a few more days." I nodded, barely able to murmur a thank you, while only one question lingered in my mind. Why my son? Why had fate brought him to the edge between life and death? I watched the doctor leave, and my eyes returned to Stephen. He was sleeping, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. The bruises on his arms and forehead were a painful reminder of that night when Valerie pushed him into the freezing lake. I stayed there, motionless, letting the memories return like an old movie slowly rewinding in my head. I saw Robert, my husband, again, on the last morning before he disappeared forever. It was a sunny day in San Antonio, Texas, 20 years ago. Robert was standing in front of the door, his green backpack on his shoulder, whistling a cheerful tune he loved. "I'll be back soon, Mary," he said to me, with a smile as radiant as the sun. It was a hiking trip he had enthusiastically prepared for all week, but it was the last time I saw him. Days later, the police came to my house with the news of an unsuccessful search in the forest. They said maybe he had an accident, maybe he got lost. There was no body, no clues, just a cold report. Missing. I hugged Lucy and Stephen, my two small children, and promised myself to be strong. But every night, when they slept, I sat alone in the darkness and cried for the man I could never say goodbye to. Raising my two children was a long and hard road. Lucy, my eldest daughter, was always strong, like a flame. I remember once when Stephen was bullied at school for being too quiet, Lucy stepped in front of him and pointed at the bully. "Don't you dare touch my brother again or you'll regret it." Her voice sounded firm, without fear, even though she was only 10 years old. Lucy grew up with an iron will and decided to become a police investigator, as if she were looking for answers that our family never got. I was always proud of her, though also worried, because I knew her job was not only dangerous, but also a way of challenging our painful past. Stephen was different, noble, sensitive, with a huge heart. Perhaps because he lost his father so young, he poured himself into business, as if that could fill the void. I still remember the day he brought home his first major contract, at only 25 years old. He had saved the Montclair family's company from bankruptcy, and his eyes shone as he told me about it. "Mom, I did it. I want you to be proud of me." I hugged him tightly with tears in my eyes. My Stephen, a brilliant young man, always trying to prove he was strong enough to protect his family. It was at that celebration party when Valerie appeared. I can still see the way she looked at him, not with love or admiration, but with calculation. She wore a deep red dress, a perfect, rehearsed smile, and approached to talk to my son. Mr. Montclair, her father, patted Stephen on the shoulder, calling him the golden boy in a jovial voice. From the corner where I was, I felt an unease that I couldn't explain. The wedding came soon after, an event so luxurious it took my breath away. The Montclair family spared no expense, imported flowers, live orchestra, everything was impeccable. They insisted that Valerie and Stephen live with me, saying that way they could take better care of him. But I knew the truth. My house, a spacious property in a privileged area of San Antonio, was what they really wanted. I accepted, not because I trusted them, but because I wanted to have Stephen close, to make sure he was safe. In the first few days, life seemed fine. Valerie played the role of a dedicated wife, always smiling in front of others, preparing dinner and taking care of the house. But I felt the distance in every one of her gestures. She never asked Stephen how he felt. She never sat down to listen to the stories he told. All she cared about were the expensive gifts my son brought. A Gucci brand bag, a pair of shoes from Europe, or luxurious trips. I saw the light in Stephen's eyes dimming, but he never complained. He always said, "Mom, she just needs time to adjust. I'll do everything I can to make her happy." Everything started to change one night, a few months ago, when the phone rang at midnight. I woke up startled. My heart pounded as I heard the voice of a firefighter on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Mary, come to the hospital immediately. The Montclair Group warehouse is on fire. Your son was rushed to the emergency room." I didn't think of anything else. I put on my coat and ran out of the house, my head full of terrifying images. Stephen, my son, the man who always put the safety of others before his own, was paying a very high price again. When I arrived at the hospital, the scene I saw left me breathless. Stephen lay in the emergency room, covered in soot, his clothes burned, his face pale under the cold neon light. Valerie was also there, but not next to him. She wasn't holding his hand or comforting him. Instead, she was in a corner, talking on the phone, annoyed, discussing with her lawyer and the insurer about the material damages. She never once looked at Stephen, not a single sign of concern for the man who was fighting between life and death. I watched her, and a mixture of rage and pain burned inside me. This was the woman my son had chosen to love, the one he had sacrificed everything for. The doctor called me aside. His voice was serious and cautious. He explained that while trying to rescue a worker trapped in the fire, a steel beam fell from the ceiling and crushed Stephen's back. The medical terms made me dizzy, but I understood one phrase with absolute clarity. His spine suffered severe damage affecting the spinal cord. He will be able to walk, but the nerve connection to the bladder is permanently damaged. He will not be able to control urination. I felt the world collapse. I looked at him, wanting to ask if he was wrong, wanting to scream that my son didn't deserve this, but I just nodded as tears fell silently. Since then, life in my house changed completely. Valerie, in front of the press and business partners, continued to play the role of the exemplary wife, appearing in interviews with a perfect smile, talking about how she did everything possible to care for her husband. But when the door closed, that mask fell, revealing a completely different person. She moved to the guest room, saying she needed a quiet space to sleep. I saw her fill the house with dozens of air fresheners, which she placed in every corner, complaining about the hospital smell that, according to her, permeated the air. Her cruelty began to show more and more. Once, while I was helping Stephen change clothes, she passed through the hallway, glanced at us, and said coldly, "Again? Why can't you try a little harder?" Her voice cut like a knife without a hint of compassion. I saw Stephen's hands tremble, his eyes drop to the floor, and he just nodded silently, as if asking for forgiveness. One night, Stephen tried to make her happy. He placed a large bouquet of roses on the dining room table, carefully choosing each flower to celebrate their anniversary. I saw him sitting there, with a spark of hope in his eyes, as if a single smile from Valerie would be enough to alleviate his pain. But when she arrived, she barely looked at the flowers, and without saying a word, she threw them in the trash can. "I hate roses," she said in a cold voice, even though I knew they had once been her favorite. Stephen stayed there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes broken. I, from the kitchen, gripped the edge of the table, holding back tears so as not to run and hug him. Valerie began to show her contempt without disguise. Every time her friends came over, she sought an excuse to keep Stephen in his room, as if he were something to be ashamed of. One day I accidentally overheard a call she had with a friend. "I'm exhausted," she said with a tone of weariness. "I feel like my life is trapped with a burden. I don't know how much more I can take." I stayed behind the door, my heart shattered. Stephen, my son, the man who loved her with all his being, was now called a burden. The most painful point came one night I will never forget. Stephen, his hands still trembling from the accident's aftermath, accidentally dropped a glass on the floor. The sound of the breaking glass filled the silence of the house. Valerie suddenly stood up, furious, her face flushed. "You're embarrassing me," she screamed, her voice high-pitched and full of contempt. "Why do I have to live with a useless person like you?" I couldn't take it anymore. I walked out of the kitchen. My voice trembled with anger. "Valerie, how can you talk to your husband like that? My son is not useless." She turned to me with a defiant look, without a trace of remorse. "This is a matter between my husband and me," she said, her voice cold as ice. "Don't interfere, mother-in-law." Stephen took my hand, his voice weak. "Mom, don't blame her. Work has been very stressful lately. She's tired." I looked at him and saw his eyes reddened, and I felt as if my heart was being torn out. He always justified her, always looked for a reason to excuse her cruel words. Every night when I passed by his room, I heard his heavy sighs. The light in Stephen's eyes was going out, replaced by a deep sadness, a resignation that hurt to watch him endure. That night, the yellowish light of the chandelier fell on the table, but the atmosphere was as cold as a winter day. Stephen stirred his now cold soup with a spoon, his gaze lowered, avoiding crossing it with his wife's. Valerie, with an empty expression, suddenly spoke in a monotonous tone. like someone reading an announcement. Elizabeth is getting married. The wedding will be at Hidden Lake Resort, a luxury place. They already bought all the plane tickets for the guests, only important people. She continued talking about the expensive dresses, the custom-made jewelry, as if showing off an achievement. I listened in silence, my heart heavy. She never once mentioned Stephen, never once asked him if he wanted to go. I looked at him and saw his shoulders tremble, as if he was holding back a pain he couldn't express. Suddenly, Stephen looked up. His voice was low but full of hope. "Then we'll go together, won't we?" I saw his eyes light up, as if just a yes from Valerie would dispel all the darkness. But she let out a cold little laugh, without the slightest trace of tenderness. "Of course not," she said calmly, as if talking about the weather. "Have you thought about what people would say if they saw you like this?" She emphasized the word "like this," as if talking about a defective object. I saw Stephen's shoulders slump. His hand squeezed the fork, but he said nothing more. He just pushed the food around on the plate, in silence. In the following days, I noticed Valerie was more tense. She closed her room door and spoke on the phone in a low, hurried tone. One afternoon, while passing by her room to take clean clothes to Stephen, I heard her conversation with her mother, Mrs. Montclair. The woman's voice was sharp, authoritative. "You have to bring him, Valerie. Do you understand? If Stephen doesn't show up, the partners won't send the gifts. Elizabeth's wedding needs that money. Think about the family." I froze in front of the door, the basket gripped in my hands, as if a bucket of cold water had been thrown on me. So it was all a farce. Valerie didn't want to bring Stephen out of affection or respect, but for convenience. I walked away, my heart heavy, swearing I would do whatever it took to protect my son. That night, Valerie entered Stephen's room. Her smile was so fake it gave me the chills. She sat on the edge of the bed, stroked his hair, and said in a voice sweet as honey, "Honey, I thought about it. I can't go to my sister's wedding without my husband. Will you come with me?" Stephen looked up, his face lit up like a child receiving a gift. "Really, Valerie?" he asked in a trembling voice. She nodded with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I, from the corner, watched with an oppressed heart. Stephen, with his noble soul, believed in her repentance. But I knew the truth, and my mother's instinct screamed that something terrible was about to happen. I decided to go with them. When I told them I wanted to rest and get some fresh air at Hidden Lake Resort, Valerie raised an eyebrow, showing slight annoyance, but she didn't protest. Stephen smiled, took my hand and said, "I'm glad you're coming, Mum." I nodded, trying to hide my uneasiness. Before the trip, I discreetly packed a bag for Stephen. Clean clothes, towels, and things he might need due to his condition. I didn't know why I was doing it. I just felt I had to be prepared for the worst. The trip to Hidden Lake Resort was long and stifling. Valerie was in the front seat, focused on her phone, smiling occasionally at the messages she received. Stephen, sitting next to me, tried to talk to her about the scenery, the mountains, the pine forests covered in mist. "Look, it's beautiful," he said enthusiastically. But Valerie just murmured something without looking up. I saw the spark dim in my son's eyes, and I had to turn toward the window to hide the tears that threatened to fall. When we arrived at Hidden Lake Resort, the landscape unfolded before us like a perfect painting. The tall pines surrounded the complex of wooden cabins. Hundreds of yellow lights shone under the sunset, and the surface of the lake, calm as a mirror, reflected the last rays of the sun. Soft music was heard from afar, mixed with the laughter and conversations of the guests. But that beauty didn't calm me. I felt as if I were entering a carefully staged setting, where everything was false and tragedy was lurking. I squeezed Stephen's hand, trying to smile at him. "Today will be a happy day for us, won't it?" he said. He nodded, but I saw the concern in his eyes, as if he also felt that something wasn't right. That night, when the party began, I didn't take my eyes off Stephen. I saw how Valerie avoided him, how she laughed and chatted with the important guests, while her husband was left alone in a corner. I wanted to take him away from there, go home, but I knew he wouldn't accept. He still had hope. He still believed he could save his marriage. And then, when it all happened, when the smiles and applause turned into my screams of horror, when I saw Valerie push my son toward the freezing waters of the lake, I understood that my premonition had been true. Now I only wished I could hug him, protect him from all the pain that life had thrown at him. But Valerie, who should have been his refuge, never appeared at the hospital even once since that day. Not a word, not a look of concern. Her absence was a cold confirmation of what I had seen at the lake. 2 days later, my phone started vibrating non-stop, like a small storm in my pocket. Friends, distant relatives, and even old neighbors I hadn't seen in years called me to ask. A close friend, Rose, sent me a message with a link and a single line. "Mary, look at this." I hesitated. My fingers trembled on the screen. I wasn't sure I had the strength to face anything else, but in the end, I opened it. The video appeared, blurry and shaky, clearly recorded with a phone from a hidden corner of the party. It started by showing Stephen in his wheelchair, his face trying to smile even though I knew he was holding back the pain. And then the moment came. Valerie lunged at him, her face flushed, her hands forcefully pushing the chair toward the edge of the lake. The camera wasn't in front of them, but it was enough to see the determined, intentional gesture. The splash of the water when Stephen fell was clearly heard, but what made my heart stop was the sound afterward. My own desperate scream. "Help! My son!" mixed with the mocking laughter of some tipsy guests. They laughed as if it were a joke, as if my son wasn't fighting for his life in that freezing water. I turned off the phone, my hands trembling so much I almost dropped it. Tears flowed, not of rage, but of helplessness. That video, like a sharp blade, deepened my pain even more. It spread at a terrifying speed on social media, with sensational headlines. "Cruel wife pushes her disabled husband into freezing lake. The truth behind the Montclair family's glamour." Thousands of comments demanded justice for Stephen. They insulted Valerie and her family. Some journalists started calling me, wanting to interview me, for me to tell my version. For an instant, I felt a ray of hope. I thought the public pressure, the indignant voices online, would force the Montclairs to face the truth. I thought justice would finally be on my son's side, but I was naive. Just 1 day later, the Montclair family reacted with astonishing speed, as if they had everything prepared. They sent an official statement to all the major media outlets, with a perfectly polished explanation. Due to the darkness and the sloping ground, Mr. Burr, Stephen's wheelchair unfortunately slid. They said Valerie, in her desperation, had tried to stop the chair, without success. They blamed the deceptive angle of the video and announced they would sue the person responsible for posting it for defamation. I read that statement, every word hitting my faith like a hammer. They were distorting the truth, turning Valerie's cruel act into a tragic accident. And they didn't stop there. Valerie appeared in an exclusive interview on a major television channel. She wore pale makeup, her eyes swollen as if she had cried, dressed in a simple outfit, very different from her usual style. Sitting in front of the camera, with a trembling voice, she spoke about how she had devotedly cared for her husband and about the pain of being misunderstood. "I loved my husband more than anything," she sobbed, tears running down her cheeks. How could I have harmed him? I looked at the screen and felt someone squeezing my throat. Every word she said was a blatant lie, but the way she said it, the way she cried, chilled my blood. It was too perfect, too convincing. The effect of that farce was terrifying. Public opinion began to change. More and more comments appeared, pitying Valerie. Maybe we were too harsh in judging her, someone wrote. She looks so miserable, another person commented. The Montclair family has always been known for their kindness. It must all have been a misunderstanding. I read those words and felt the whole world turning its back on the truth. Those who had previously demanded justice for Stephen began to doubt themselves. The truth, the thing I had seen with my own eyes, was being distorted right in front of me. I felt helpless, as if I were in the middle of a storm with no way to resist. I sat in the hospital room looking at my sleeping son. Stephen still didn't know anything about the video or Valerie's lies, and I didn't want him to have to face them. He had already suffered too much. I gently stroked his hand, as silent tears fell onto his skin. I wondered what I had done wrong for my son to have to go through so much pain. I wondered if I hadn't been strong enough to protect him, to stop Valerie from the beginning. At that moment, the room door burst open. I looked up and saw Lucy, my eldest daughter, standing there. She was wearing her old police uniform, her hair tied back in a bun, and her face marked by fatigue after the long trip from New York City. Her eyes were sharp, but when she looked at me, they softened, full of affection. She didn't say anything. She just walked over and hugged me. Her arms were warm and firm, as if reminding me that I wasn't alone. "I know everything, Mum," Lucy whispered, her voice hoarse but determined. I cried in her arms, letting all the sadness and helplessness contained for so long pour out at once. "Lucy, they're lying. Everyone believes them. They're hiding the truth, and I don't know what to do." Lucy pulled back a little, put a hand on my shoulder, and looked at me intently, with a fierce determination. "Mum, don't believe what people say," she said in a firm voice, almost like a vow. "Believe in me. I won't let them get away with it. I'm going to get justice for my brother." Her words lit a small flame in me, a spark of hope in the middle of the storm. That determined look, that confident voice, restored my faith that the truth, however hidden it might be, would come to light. But as I stayed in the room watching Stephen sleep, with his weak, paused breathing, an image sparked in my mind. The terrified eyes of Mr. Ernest, the lake caretaker, that fateful night. He had wanted to tell me something, but the sound of the ambulance interrupted him. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I was that there was something bigger, darker, hidden beneath the calm surface of Hidden Lake. I knew I had to act. I lied to Lucy, telling her I had to go back home to get some things for Stephen. "It'll just be a moment. Stay here with him," I told her, trying to sound calm so she wouldn't worry. Lucy nodded, although her questioning gaze seemed to ask me what I was hiding. I didn't dare look her in the eyes. I quickly left the hospital, got in the car, and drove straight to Hidden Lake Resort. The mountain road stretched out before me, full of curves that took me closer and closer to a mystery I wasn't yet ready to face. But for Stephen, for my family, I couldn't stop. When I arrived at the resort, the splendor of the party night had disappeared. There were no golden lights or soft music. Only a chilling silence remained, as if the lake held a secret it didn't want to be revealed. I found Mr. Ernest near the shore, repairing a broken section of the wooden fence. He seemed to have aged 10 years since the last time I saw him. Deep, dark circles under his eyes, trembling hands holding the hammer. When he saw me, he flinched and looked around, afraid someone was watching him. "Mrs. Mary," he murmured in a low, almost trembling voice. "Why have you come back?" I approached slowly, speaking softly. "Mr. Ernest, I came to thank you. You saved my son's life. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened." He nodded without looking at me, clutching the hammer as if it were the only thing keeping him standing. I took a deep breath and went straight to the point. "Mr. Ernest, my daughter is a police officer. She is investigating Stephen's case. I need you to testify, to tell the truth, that it was Valerie who pushed my son into the lake." His face immediately paled, as if I had touched the bottom of a deep fear. He lowered his gaze, his voice trembled. "Mrs. Mary, I can't. The Montclair family, they own this place. I have a wife and children to support. They came to see me right after that night. They gave me a large sum of money, and they warned me I would lose my job if I said anything." He stopped, his eyes full of anguish, as if an internal struggle was consuming him. I felt my heart shrink, but I didn't give up. I remembered his look that night. It wasn't just the fear of someone trying to save a life. There was something deeper, the reflection of a terrifying secret that had not yet been told. "It's not just that, is it, Mr. Ernest?" I said, my voice slow but firm. "That night you were going to tell me something, what you saw in the lake." Silence fell, heavy as the still surface of the water. He stared intently at the lake, gripping the hammer so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I saw that he was struggling, as if that secret were a burden too heavy to continue carrying. Finally, he led me to a corner behind the boat shed, where no one could hear us. His voice trembled, almost a whisper. "Mrs. Mary, I have to tell the truth. I've been tormented these last few days. I can't sleep. I can't stop thinking about it." He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "When I dived to pull your son out, my foot got tangled in something. At first I thought it was a stone or a branch, but no. I put my hand in the murky, freezing water, and I touched bones, a chest, and a skull." His voice faded, as if he feared his own words. I held my breath. A chill ran down my spine. A human skeleton at the bottom of the lake where the Montclair family celebrated their luxurious wedding. That couldn't be a coincidence. He continued, his gaze full of anguish. "I thought about calling the police right away. But that day, you rushed off to the hospital with young Stephen, and then the Montclairs arrived. They didn't just offer money, they also threatened. They said that if I spoke, my family wouldn't be safe. I was so scared, Mrs. Mary, but I can't keep quiet anymore. Down there's a human skeleton." He lowered his head, as if he had just released an enormous weight, although his face was still marked by fear. I stood paralyzed, trying to assimilate that terrifying revelation. A skeleton at the bottom of the lake. I thought of Robert, my husband, who disappeared 20 years ago during a mountain hike. Could it be? No, I didn't want to follow that thought. But deep down, I knew that secret was no coincidence. The Montclair family, with all their wealth and power, was hiding something dark. And I, as a mother, as a wife, couldn't allow the truth to remain buried. I looked directly into Mr. Ernest's eyes, and although my voice trembled, I spoke firmly. "Thank you, Mr. Ernest. You did the right thing by telling me. I'll tell my daughter. She's a police officer. She'll know what to do." He nodded, but his eyes remained uneasy, as if he knew his words would bring a storm. I squeezed his hand, silently promising to protect him, although I wasn't sure I could fulfill it. As soon as I left the resort, my phone rang. It was Lucy. I answered immediately, my heart pounding. Her voice on the other end was agitated, excited, but also worried. "Mom, where are you? Come home right now." "I found something Dad left behind. I think—" I didn't ask any more questions. I just ran to the car, my mind in chaos. I drove home, my thoughts spinning non-stop. I rushed inside, panting, my heart beating hard. Robert's old study appeared before me, covered by a thin layer of dust, like a veil of memories. Lucy was sitting on the floor, her hair slightly messy, her eyes shining with a determination I had rarely seen. In front of her was the oak chest that Robert always kept locked, where he stored his most prized possessions. The lid was open, as if inviting me to face the past. "How did you manage to open it?" I asked, my voice broken by emotion. Robert never revealed where the key was, and for 20 years I respected that privacy without daring to touch it. Lucy pointed to the shelf, where 100 years of solitude rested crookedly. "I remembered Dad used to say that the keys to the biggest secrets are always hidden in the great stories," she said in a low but confident voice. She had found a small bronze key hidden in the spine of the book. I looked at her, feeling pride and sadness at the same time. Lucy, my strong and perceptive daughter, had inherited her father's intuition, and now she was ready to unearth the past in search of justice. Lucy straightened up, her voice clear and methodical, as if presenting a case to a judge. "At first, I only wanted to investigate the Montclair Group's finances, look for something that would compromise them to pressure them into admitting what they did to Stephen," she began. "I used my credentials to access the file of Capital Credit, the company where Dad worked." She opened an old human resources file with yellowed papers and almost faded ink. "And I found this name, Lawrence Montclair." Mr. Montclair was the head of finance, Dad's direct superior. I froze, feeling as if someone had sucked all the air out of the room. "Why didn't Dad ever tell me?" I gasped, my voice trembling. Lucy looked at me with a sweet but firm expression. "Maybe because he didn't want to worry you," she said. "But the suspicious thing is that the records indicate that Mr. Montclair requested a sudden leave of absence just 3 weeks after Dad's disappearance, claiming family health problems. Years later, he used a huge sum of money, of unknown origin, to buy a bankrupt subsidiary of the same Capital Credit. That was the foundation of the current Montclair Group." I felt my heart pounding, as if the pieces of the past were starting to fit together. But they were so sharp that I was afraid just to think about it. Lucy turned back to the wooden chest and carefully took out the objects inside. I had always thought it contained photos, love letters, or memories of Robert and me. But no. Inside were carefully organized folders, as if Robert had prepared them for the day the truth would come out. My daughter pulled out a worn leather notebook with Robert's familiar handwriting. It wasn't a diary, but research notes, numbers, diagrams of money flows, and abbreviated names. Lucy pointed to one of the names, circled many times. LM, Lawrence Montclair. A chill ran down my spine, as if Robert were speaking to me from those pages. Dad discovered a large-scale embezzlement and money laundering scheme within the company, Lucy explained in a serious voice. He wrote everything down. The transactions, the bank accounts overseas, and the covert acquisition plans. Everything points to Mr. Montclair. My daughter turned more pages, showing me bank statements, figures, and signatures carefully recorded, like an undeniable accusation. I looked at them, my heart tight. Robert, my kind and quiet husband, wasn't just working to support us. He faced a dark power that none of us knew about. Then Lucy carefully pulled out a piece of paper folded into 4, yellowed with time, tucked between the last pages of the notebook. She unfolded it delicately, as if afraid of damaging something sacred. It was Robert's hurried but firm handwriting. March 14th. LM just invited me on a mountain hike to talk privately. He doesn't know I already have all the evidence. I'm going to try to convince him to turn himself in. If anything happens to me, Montclair is responsible. I read those lines, and tears flowed uncontrollably. The room turned cold, as if Robert's spirit was there, watching us, waiting for justice. Lucy and I looked at each other, not speaking for a long time. For 20 years, I believed my husband had died in an accident in the forest. I cried, I prayed, I tried to accept that wild nature had taken him from me. But no, Robert was not lost. He went there to confront a dangerous man, hoping to protect the truth, and he paid with his life. 2 days later, while we were still trying to connect the evidence, the doorbell rang, sharp in the silence of the night. I jumped, my heart pounded. Lucy, sitting in front of me with a pile of documents, got up and looked through the peephole. "It's Elizabeth Montclair," she said in a tense voice, frowning. I stood still. What was Elizabeth, Valerie's sister, doing at our door? A feeling of unease washed over me, mixed with curiosity. Lucy looked at me, waiting for my decision. I took a deep breath and nodded. "Open the door, honey." The door opened, and there was Elizabeth, small and fragile under the yellowish light of the hallway. She wore no makeup. Her hair was carelessly tied back, and she wore a simple coat, very different from her sister's glamorous image. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying, and her hands trembled as she held her purse. "Mrs. Mary, Mrs. Lucy," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry for coming unannounced. I can't take it anymore. I've seen everything. Valerie, she pushed Stephen on purpose. My family's lies are driving me crazy." Lucy and I looked at each other, suspicious. Elizabeth, the forgotten shadow of the Montclairs, was now saying words I never imagined hearing. "I want to testify," she continued, her voice trembling but determined. "And I have this." She explained that the wedding filming crew had recorded everything from another angle, much clearer than the viral video. She had convinced one of the cameramen to give her an original copy, and now she had come to hand it over to us. Her words were like a ray of light in the darkness, but I still couldn't completely trust her. The Montclair family had taught me that nothing is as it seems. "Come in, Elizabeth," Lucy said in a serene but cold tone, like a police inspector. I invited her to sit on the sofa, although the air was charged with tension. Elizabeth, trembling, put her purse on the coffee table, trying to take out her phone to show us the video. But from nervousness, her hands failed and the purse fell to the floor. All its contents scattered. A lipstick, a bunch of keys, a wallet, and a shiny metallic object rolled until it stopped right at my feet. I leaned down, my heart pounding as I realized it was a simple but unmistakable silver wedding ring. Inside, the delicately engraved inscription was clearly visible: Robert and Mary. My breath caught, as if the world suddenly stopped moving. My hands trembled as I picked up the ring. The cold metal spread throughout my body. "This," I whispered, my voice broken. "Why do you have it?" Elizabeth looked at the ring. Her face went from surprise to horror, as if she herself didn't understand what was happening. I, she stammered, her eyes full of tears. "I didn't know it was yours. I found it when I was a child. I was barely 9 years old." She closed her eyes, trying to remember. her voice trembling, as if sinking into her own memories. That day, my dad said he would take me camping in a very beautiful place. He went with another man, a very kind uncle. I don't remember his face well, but he told stories and laughed a lot. I squeezed the ring hard, feeling my heart constrict. Elizabeth continued, her voice getting lower. I remember Hidden Lake was very wild back then, nothing like the resort now. My dad and the uncle set up the tent near the shore. That night I saw them go out to talk near a large rock. The uncle left the ring on the stone. I picked it up and I thought I'd give it back the next day. I thought it was pretty, so I put it in my pocket. Tears began to stream down her cheeks. But the next morning, only my dad came back to the tent. He was in a hurry, packing everything up, and he said his friend had left early. I asked him about him, but he got angry and told me to be quiet. I kept the ring all these years. I always had the feeling that one day I would see the uncle again to give it back to him. I didn't know he was your husband. I stood paralyzed. The ring in my hand weighed like a stone. Everything was clear. The man who accompanied Mr. Montclair that night was Robert, my husband, and the skeleton that Mr. Ernest had touched at the bottom of the lake. My skin crawled, unable to continue thinking. But the truth, however painful, could no longer remain buried. I looked at Lucy, and I saw her eyes red but firm. I didn't need to say anything. She already understood. Her father's disappearance 20 years ago, and Stephen's case in the present, led to the same point: the freezing lake of Hidden Lake Resort. After Elizabeth left, leaving Robert's wedding ring and her promise to cooperate, my house was plunged into a suffocating silence. Lucy, with the determination of a police officer, didn't waste a minute. She immediately called her superior in New York City. In a firm but hurried voice, she informed them about the new findings related to her father's disappearance 20 years ago. "We need an urgent order to search and excavate Hidden Lake Resort," she said, with a gaze that burned like fire. I watched her, feeling both pride and sadness. Lucy, my strong daughter, was continuing the fight her father had started. And I knew that this time, we wouldn't let the truth remain hidden. At dawn the next day, Lucy and I returned to Hidden Lake Resort. The idyllic landscape that had once amazed me had disappeared, replaced by yellow police tape cordoning off the entire area. A forensic team and professional divers were already there, equipped to sweep the bottom of the lake. Mr. Ernest was in a corner, his face tense and his dark circles deep, as if he hadn't slept all night. He pointed the divers to the exact spot where he had touched the remains, in a trembling but determined voice. I looked at him, feeling gratitude and compassion. He had chosen to side with the truth, even when the price was his own safety and that of his family, Mr. Montclair was also summoned to the location as the property owner. He arrived accompanied by an expensive lawyer in an impeccable suit that failed to hide his tension. I saw him clench his fists, his knuckles white, as the divers prepared. I stood next to Lucy on the shore, holding her hand tightly, feeling the air become thick, crushing my chest. Every second stretched out like a century, and I couldn't help but think of Robert, of what he must have suffered, of the years I spent living with pain without an answer. After 1 hour, a diver emerged from the water, raising his hand. They had found something. They lowered a special net stretcher, and as they brought it up, the entire forensic team held their breath. On the mesh was a human skeleton, blackened by the years under the water, the clothing reduced to shreds. I stood motionless, my feet nailed to the ground, my eyes fixed on the remains. Although only bones remained, I recognized the stainless steel watch, the one I had given Robert for our 10th anniversary. The dial had stopped long ago, but the fine markings were still distinguishable. Tears streamed down uncontrollably. It was Robert, the man I loved and lost, now in front of me, cold and silent. Lucy signalled an officer to approach and escort Mr. Montclair. "Mr. Lawrence Montclair," she said in a cold, firm voice, "you are under arrest on suspicion of involvement in a homicide." Mr. Montclair immediately started shouting, his voice high-pitched, full of panic. "Absurd! You have no proof! This is slander!" But I saw his gaze falter, as if he knew his wall of defence was about to crumble. In the interrogation room at the police station, Lucy did not participate directly, but stayed with me in the observation room, behind the one-way mirror. A veteran agent took charge of the interrogation, with a calm but sharp tone. They presented the evidence step by step, like knives being slowly drawn from their sheath. First, Robert's notebook, with detailed notes about the embezzlement scheme. Mr. Montclair laughed contemptuously, saying it was a forgery, but his voice lacked conviction. Then came Elizabeth's statement about the wedding ring and that camping trip 20 years ago. He roared, calling his daughter an ungrateful traitor, but his face began to pale. Afterward, they showed the original video of Elizabeth's wedding, provided by her herself. The angle was frontal, perfectly clear, and showed how Valerie coldly pushed Stephen's wheelchair toward the lake, without the slightest doubt. Mr. Montclair's face completely changed, from anger to panic. The agent continued, with a monotonous voice, but full of weight. "We have an arrest warrant for your daughter, Valerie Montclair, for attempted murder with danger to life. For this charge, she could spend many years in prison." That was the final blow. Thinking of Valerie, his adored daughter, going to jail, completely broke Mr. Montclair's defences. He panicked, his hands trembling, and he began to murmur incoherently. "It wasn't her. Valerie didn't do anything," he shouted, tears streaming down his aged face. "She only did what she saw me do. I am the one responsible." That confession broke the dam and let out all the buried truth. Mr. Montclair recounted, his voice catching, that Robert had discovered his embezzlement and money laundering scheme at Capital Credit. Robert, moved by his integrity, had summoned him to Hidden Lake Resort to convince him to turn himself in. "He was too naive," Montclair said bitterly. "Did he really think I would give up everything for a few moral words? I took Elizabeth, who was still a child, as a distraction. That night, when she was already sleeping, I went out with Robert to the lake shore. He gave me two options: confess, or he would go to the police. He left me no other way out." He recounted, with a trembling voice, how he took a large rock and hit Robert from behind. Then he sank my husband's body into the lake, using more stones to ensure he would never surface. Behind the mirror, I listened to every word, feeling my heart break. Robert, my beloved husband, had not died in an accident, but for his integrity. My tears fell, but this time they were not just of pain. They were of liberation, because finally the truth had come to light. The case that had lasted 20 years was finally closed with the confession of the killer. The trial against the Montclair family then became the centre of national attention. The days of waiting for the verdict seemed endless, but when the truth was fully revealed, I felt relief, although accompanied by an indelible pain. With Mr. Montclair's confession, the DNA results of the remains, Robert's notebook, and the testimonies of Mr. Ernest and Elizabeth, the sentence came quickly. Mr. Montclair was sentenced to life in prison for murder and concealment of a corpse. He, who was once at the peak of power, now bowed his head in the courtroom, with no trace of the brilliance of that successful businessman. Valerie, although not directly involved in Robert's death, also had to pay for her actions. She was sentenced to several years in prison for intentional injury and false testimony, in addition to cover-up. I looked at her in the courtroom. Her face, once arrogant, was now pale, and her gaze empty. I felt no satisfaction, only a deep sadness, not for her but for Stephen, who had loved her with all his heart. The Montclair Empire, a symbol of wealth and success, collapsed in a single night. Stocks plummeted, partners broke contracts, and their reputation vanished. The news flooded the media and networks, but I no longer cared. For me, justice was not in their downfall, but in the fact that my family finally knew the truth, and Robert, the man I loved, was vindicated. Stephen, once fully recovered, returned home with an evident change. He was no longer the young man trying to please everyone. One morning he handed me an envelope, his voice soft but firm. "Mum, I've filed for divorce. I don't want to keep living with those memories." I looked at him and saw a new light in his eyes, a quiet strength, though still hurting. He didn't mention Valerie or blame her. He simply decided to turn the page. Shortly after, Stephen began participating in support groups for people with disabilities, sharing his story as inspiration. "Mum, I want others to see that they are not useless, that they can have a better life," he once told me, and I hugged him tightly, letting the tears fall silently. My son, though he lost so much, found meaning in the pain. One afternoon, I decided to go to the small apartment that Elizabeth and her newly married husband were renting. She, who had had the courage to confront her own family, was now rejected by her mother and sister. I stood in front of the door, with a small bouquet of flowers in my hand, and my heart full of mixed feelings. When Elizabeth opened it, I saw her eyes were swollen, as if she had been crying. "Mrs. Mary," she whispered, her voice choked. "My mum and sister called me. They said I'm a traitor, that I destroyed my family and sent my father to jail." Tears ran down her cheeks, and before me, she was no longer the daughter of a powerful family, but a young woman suffering the weight of loneliness. I didn't say anything. I just walked over and hugged her. "You didn't destroy anyone, Elizabeth," I murmured to her in a trembling voice. "You saved your family's soul. You did the right thing, and you should be proud to have been on the side of justice." Elizabeth hugged me tightly, sobbing inconsolably in my arms, and I felt her fragility, but also the strength of someone who dares to face the truth. I said goodbye, leaving the flowers and the promise that she would always be welcome in my house as part of the family. Months later, we held a proper funeral for Robert. His remains were placed in an elegant wooden coffin and buried in the city cemetery, next to his parents' graves. That day, the sky was clear, and the spring sun bathed everything with its warmth, dispelling the cold that had accompanied my family for 20 years. Lucy, in her police uniform, stood firm, her eyes red but determined. Stephen, in his wheelchair, took my hand with a gentle but meaningful smile. I placed a bouquet of white lilies on the grave, Robert's favourite flowers. 20 years under the ice, Robert," I whispered, as tears fell down my cheeks. "Now you can finally rest in peace." Lucy took my hand, and Stephen put his on his sister's shoulder. We stayed there, the three of us, a family that had finally found peace. I looked up at the sky and felt the warm sun on my face, as if Robert were smiling at us from somewhere. The ice of Hidden Lake Resort had melted, and with it, the ice in our souls also disappeared. I knew this journey had left scars that would never heal, but it had also given us the strength to keep living, to love, and to believe that justice, though late, always finds a way to be reborn. I looked at my two children, who had walked with me through the darkness to find the light. "We did it," I said, my voice trembling but full of pride. Lucy nodded, Stephen smiled, and at that moment I knew that however painful the past was, we still had each other. Our family, though marked by loss, was still standing, and that was the most important thing. After everything we lived through, I understood something. Justice may be delayed, but it never disappears. It only waits for someone who has the courage to awaken it. In the darkness of lies, ambition, and power, the truth remains alive, like a small flame that never goes out. I once thought that forgiveness was the only way to find peace. But sometimes, only when the truth comes to light, can the human soul truly be set free. Life took my husband from me, and almost took my son, but it also showed me the strength of a mother's love, of integrity, and of faith in justice. The lesson I want to leave with you is this: never stay silent in the face of evil, even if it is disguised as success or money. Because our silence is the ground where sin flourishes, and only when we dare to confront it can we live under the light of truth. The story you have just heard has changed the names and locations to protect the identity of those involved. We tell it not to judge, but with the hope that someone listens and reflects. How many mothers are suffering in silence inside their own homes? I truly wonder, if you were in my place, what would you do? Would you choose silence to maintain peace? Or would you have the courage to face everything to reclaim your voice? I want to know your opinion, because every story can be a candle that lights the way for someone else. God always blesses, and I firmly believe that courage will lead us to better days. Now, on the final screen, I'll leave two of the channel's most loved stories. I'm sure they will surprise you. Thank you for staying with me until this moment. Are you ready?